Welcome to Penang Institute Chats. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Richard Record from the World Bank Group. Now, Richard Record is the World Bank Group's lead economist in macroeconomics, trade and fiscal management. Welcome, Richard, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you give advice to Malaysia's policymakers on various economic policy issues relating to fiscal management and digital adoption. Right. Recently, you were involved in two rather major reports, one of which was a public policy report on the digital economy, and the Malaysia Economic Monitor, which will be on how the Malaysian economy is doing. Now, Malaysia's economy, as you know, is heavily dependent on exports, and ASEAN countries in general are heavily involved in the global supply chain. So all of them, I think, are worried about where this trade war is going to go. So the question I wish to put to you tonight is, what does the US-China trade war mean to Malaysia and to ASEAN in general?
Well, so as you rightly indicated, Malaysia is a very open economy. Trade is well over 100% of GDP, as are several other economies in ASEAN, this region. And certainly we saw through 2017, when global growth was very strong, then that translated into very robust demand for exports from the open manufacturing-oriented, trade-oriented economies in this region, of which Malaysia was certainly one of them. So anything that throws that engine into jeopardy is something certainly to be worried about. However, I would say Malaysia is actually quite well placed compared to some of the other countries in the region. The economy is diversified, so while Malaysia does depend heavily on exports, domestic demand is also very important. And similarly, on the export side, Malaysia has quite a nicely diversified export basket. So we have the modern manufactured products, principally E&E, much of which is produced right here in Penang. But there are also commodities, natural resource-based exports, as well as services and tourism, and a lot of exciting new areas in the digital economy as well. So there's, that diversification certainly helps, and it reduces the risk and vulnerability to any kind of negative shocks. But certainly anything that threatens the export side is something to worry about. From the World Bank side, we did a little bit of modeling to try and assess the impact of potential trade tensions. The tariffs in themselves are not the end of the world as we'd see it. Actually, it just means changes in relative prices. So certainly while Malaysia is dependent on final demand in the United States, much of it which goes through value chains in China, tariffs in themselves perhaps don't have a huge impact, and there's perhaps an opportunity for some diversion for Malaysia to gradually move into value chains that are routed other than through China. The big worry that we have is if some of these tensions translate into a global loss of confidence and reduction in growth and investment from either the US or China. And certainly that's a definite possibility if we see continued escalation in the tensions, lower investment. That will certainly have an impact on Malaysia and, in fact, just about all the economies in this region.
And all this is happening at a time when the world economy hasn't been very optimistic, right? And the trade war hits at this time. And I know for a fact in Malaysia there has been a great lack of optimism, and which was part of the reason why we had a change in government recently, because the economy wasn't being managed well enough despite the figures. But ASEAN as a whole, being so much a part of the global supply chain, I suppose with all these rules and its new tariffs, what will probably happen is that there will be attempts to change the country of origin, perhaps, of many goods, right? That's bound to happen. And
I'm already seeing that, actually.
We're seeing that, right? And Malaysia is bound to get dragged into it, and it won't all be lying, really, because as we know, the supply chain is global, and we can't really put a finger on where something actually does come from. It's all a matter of definition and legalities. Yeah. What about Penang itself, as a little island that once was and still is in many ways an electronic hub? What possibilities are there for a little place like this island, this little state, to handle the trade war, or apart from the trade war, to handle how the global economy is doing at the moment? Digitization is extremely important, and I think most people in Penang, and the Penang state government definitely knows a lot needs to be done. Are there advantages for places like Penang to not have been in the forefront for a while in digitization, to sort of take a leap? Are there chances of that?
No, definitely. And if you look at the story of Malaysia's economic trajectory and the exponential performance of the microelectronics export industry, it all started in Penang. So this is kind of the birthplace of that sort of the Malaysia development story if you go back 40, 50 years. There's a great starting position in terms of economic, social infrastructure, in terms of location, logistics, skills and education and endowment. So for example, without the right skills and education, not just in schools but through lifelong learning, then populations are often bypassed by the benefits of technology. Similarly, we need the right policies in place to ensure that there's ample competition in the private sector, and we don't see sort of emergence of new monopolies and anti-competitive behavior. And similarly with governments, digital technologies can allow governments to deliver better and better targeted services at lower cost, but only again if the right policies and the right institutions are in place. I think Penang has a fantastic track record in that area, so there's every chance that it'll be able to make a success as well, I think.
One thing in your report that I found interesting was Malaysians are actually very locked in, and their mobile use of the internet is way above comparable countries, right? At the same time, our fixed fiber use is very low, much lower than one would expect. What does that tell you?
So it's because when we looked at the digital economy in Malaysia, we saw this sort of strange dichotomy, because Malaysians as citizens are among the most connected in the world. More than 80% of Malaysians are online, and that's close to the frontier globally. Yet Malaysians' businesses are not performing at the same level. And you take out the superstars like Grab, iFlix, Fave, and whatever, and you look at the bulk of the private sector, they're not adopting digital technologies in depth and in the way we would expect. And one of the reasons we think is because of the dependence on mobile for internet access. Fixed and fiber is extremely low. Just 8% of businesses have a fixed or a fiber connection. And that's really what, if you're really serious about deep digital adoption, Industry 4.0, need high-speed, ultra-fast, high-speed, high-secure internet connections. And that only comes through fixed and fiber. One of the reasons we think that is because if you look at the mobile market in Malaysia, it's very competitive. 3, 4 major players all competing, offering new services, driving prices down. In fixed and fiber, we have one player with 95% market share. So it's no surprise we see a different market dynamic. But encouragingly, certainly in the last few months, we've seen some very different directions of policy from the government about how that market is going to be regulated, and perhaps with more competition, we can see things changing a little bit.
One last point, is it true that our SMEs are not very active where digitization is concerned?
Certainly from the data we see that. Now, everyone has email, most people have a website, but when you start looking at other ways of using digital technologies, it trails off very quickly. Very few firms, for example, do hiring online or training or deliver services through online channels. And of course, once you start talking about Internet of Things, cloud computing, big data, we're talking about just a handful of firms. So there's still some way to catch up, and maybe some more competitive dynamics could push more firms along.
So that's one of the areas that we should be looking at and should be advising the state government to look at as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard.
No, thanks so much
for
having me in
this
today.
coming by.